Hello, thanks ever so much for joining us. I'm Ben Tate from Princeton University Press, and it's my pleasure to welcome Martin Conway of Balliol College, Oxford. Martin and I will talk about his new book, Western Europe's Democratic Age, 1945 to 1968. Martin, you can see we've got the cover up before us now. Why don't you tell us a little bit about the cover?
Yeah, well, the cover, as always, is an image I happened upon, which is from the Italian elections in 1948. And it very much conveys what the book is about, which is about people re-engaging with the political process after the war, or in Italy's case, as this is in Italy, after the whole Mussolinian dictatorship. So the people are voting for the first time in a meaningful way for roughly nearly 30 years. And also for the first time, women are voting. So this is a moment of democratic outburst, and it's easy to think of this in really quite sort of heroic terms, that this is the moment when Europe becomes democratic. But I think the book tries to argue a slightly more subtle case, that although there's lots of engagement, as you see here, there's also a distinct air of caution about where democracy can lead, because previous experiences of democracy, be it in Italy or indeed anywhere else, had not really ended very well. And of course, there's a fear that the wrong people might also win elections. And this poster that you see there, Voting Depends, It Depends on You, is a Christian Democrat poster, where they fear that what they're trying to do is to mobilize people against the communists.
Martin, what did you learn in writing the book?
I guess what I started off thinking I would discover was about the building of a particular democratic political culture in Europe after the war, in Western Europe, because I was very conscious that it was a new departure for Western Europe to have democracy after the war. But I think as I went along, I probably discovered more about the sort of social and cultural aspects of democracy. It's easy to think of it as a political system, but what very much struck me as I was writing the book was about this also rested on a sea change, really, in social attitudes. People, in some sense, imbibe the notion of being democratic and wanted to take on board certain values of democracy, like being polite when listening to others with whom they disagreed, or about having the empowerment of democracy in daily life, of being able to give their support to somebody or to withdraw it. And I think those sort of slightly tacit forms of democracy really came to the fore in Western Europe after the war. This doesn't mean that it was a marvelously wonderful democratic culture. I think in many respects, it was really a very unequal democratic culture in which many people had much less power than some other people. But I think that the idea that democracy stuck in Western Europe after the war because it became part of how people actually thought about themselves, as well as about their political system, is probably the biggest thing I took away from it all.
Well, I'd actually like to ask about that. And specifically about what people thought or felt. You quote no less than Pius XII, who in 1944 said, "This world war, this universal upheaval must mark the inauguration of a radically new and completely rendered world." And you quote other, I suppose, comparably hyperbolic pronouncements. And you suggest that 1948 was, for all the changes introduced, was nevertheless not 1789 or 1848. So to what extent was this period, the period of the book, marked by a new aspiration? And to what extent was it marked by a combination of historically contingent factors laced with a sense of pragmatism?
Oh, certainly plenty of the latter, plenty of pragmatism, because other political systems had either ruled themselves out through their sort of authoritarianism during the war, or in the case of communism, were perceived to be the antithesis of what most people wanted. And also, therefore, people sort of back in a rather cautious way into democracy and hope that it will work out in the best way. That's certainly evident among people who are rulers, and somebody like Pius XII fears that democracy will somehow be a heroic victory of all the Freemasonic atheist forces who he opposed. So he's very cautious about it. But that sort of caution, conditionality, let's see how it turns out, is very evident in most people's approach to democracy on left and right after the war. But in the end, of course, what happened is that a sort of form of power sharing came into existence across most of Western Europe between different social classes, between different political forces, between different levels of government. And that sort of inclusive democracy in which nobody wins, but nobody utterly loses, was, I think, a very important element of this new democracy, and was in some respects a product of a learning experience. People looked back to things like the Weimar Republic and thought, this is exactly what we do not want to do. So let's try and think about a democratic system that doesn't have those costs and perils that people thought they had experienced in the interwar years.
So a sense of pragmatism then was rather important.
Absolutely, yeah. And nobody's really rushing into democracy with the enthusiasm of 1789 or 1848, as you say. You know, people have lived through too much. It's important to remember just how battered people, the survivors in many ways, I'm inclined to say, were by the experiences of the war years. There have been good moments, there have been bad moments, but it was the more general tiring trauma of the whole experience, you know, a COVID on a much larger scale, perhaps, I'm inclined to say, which meant that actually people couldn't have an excessive enthusiasm about the new politics that came into existence. People had specific ambitions, particularly, of course, we know about the enthusiasm for a greater security of life that came with welfare provision. And they wanted plenty of new things out of governments in terms of a certain sort of economic prosperity and so on. But they were also aware that actually governments couldn't just deliver things off, you know, from one day to the next. And there's a certain patience, and let's see how it turns out. And people become rather calculating about their political votes. And that's probably why people vote for the Christian Democrats in some cases, because they decide rather cautiously that this is the best way of entering into a rather limited democracy after the war.
Can you tell us something quickly about the Christian Democrats in the 1940s?
Yeah, well, they come from almost nowhere in many ways, although they like to claim that they are part of a Catholic political tradition that can go back, I don't know, hundreds of years. Really, you know, it's a circumstantial product of a new sort of Catholic secular elite coming to the fore, who think that they can combine a certain sort of loose set of Catholic social values and defense of the Catholic Church with a more modern ideology of social and economic progress, and indeed of participation in the democratic structure. It could easily have fallen flat on its face, and we wouldn't be talking about it. But in reality, in countries such as Italy, the Low Countries, Germany, Austria, and for the first 10 years in France, Christian democracy becomes a really major political force. Of course, the Christian Democrats congratulate themselves and say this is all because we've got the best program and because the good people of Europe always were Catholic. But in reality, you think it probably had more to do with the price of milk and to do with the provision of housing developments than it really had to do with specifically Catholic values.
Well, you mentioned essentially sort of material conditions. You make the point that even right-wing political parties were willing to countenance the managerial state up until the economic slump, which was eventually made manifest in the 1970s. So to what extent does a certain level of wealth you know, underpin the period that you've addressed in this book?
Yeah, it's one of those conditions, isn't it? I think we're all used to writing the history of post-1945 Western Europe as if it was a product of Cold War and economic prosperity. I try to make it a bit more complicated in the book. I don't think it's economic prosperity as a certain sort of economic predictability which matters to people. It takes a great deal of time for real prosperity to kind of enter into people's lives and for them to essentially to feel that they are better off than they used to be. You know, I suppose I'd roughly stick a pin in at the end of the 1950s for that realization to dawn upon people. But what had happened in the intervening 10 years is that they had a greater confidence that governments knew how to manage the economy, as indeed in many ways they did. They got lucky in some ways, but in other respects they were just more competent. And therefore, most sections of the population, not everybody, but most sections of the population felt that they were actually in a predictable economic regime. As I stress in the book, many of the biggest winners out of this new era of prosperity are actually the middle class and commercial farmers and people like that. It's not a redistributive prosperity. It's not really prosperity being taken away from elite groups and given to the working class. They are in many ways the last people to benefit from economic prosperity. But economic predictability, a sense that actually there's a way of actually running the economy and there's annual negotiations about paying conditions, all of that embeds itself quite quickly in people's lives. And of course, they've lived through so many traumas, and most notably the economic depression of the 1920s, that at the end of the 20s, that they like the predictability. But as your question rightly emphasizes, once sort of a politics, once an economic crisis of inflation and mass unemployment begins to reassert itself in the 1970s, then many of the elements of that decline. And my book, of course, ends with the feeling that actually Western Europe's democratic age in some ways comes to a close at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s.
Can we see after the war something like a new conception of citizenship?
Yeah, I think so. And it's a citizenship that enters into people's minds as being a rather less ideological, partisan form of citizenship. Citizenship becomes, I'm tempted to say, slightly neutral. It's what you do as a good citizen. You participate in elections and to some extent in paying your taxes and that sort of thing, in return for which you get the benefits of government. And that's perhaps a rather self-interested concept of citizenship, but it's also a calmer form of citizenship. And let's remember the gender of all of this. There's a demobilization of men out of uniforms, out of armies, out of political movements, into a civilian life after the war in their millions. And at the same time, there's an invitation, I suppose, to women to participate as citizens in the political process, in social life, more actively than had formerly been the case. This in absolutely no way means that there was gendered equality. What I'm describing there are probably two slightly separate gendered paths into citizenship, but they were ones that on the whole worked, and particularly the female one. Women actually found in democratic politics after the war a political process that was attentive to their interests in their rather gendered identities, be it as mothers, be it as employees, be it as housewives, and so on. And that sort of politics, again, perhaps associated most obviously with Christian democracy, was an important element of how democracy stabilized itself. It had the women on its side.
How exceptional was the period that you chronicle in your book?
I think now we can see how exceptional it was. This is probably the only period in modern European history when there are very similar political regimes across the whole of Western Europe. A certain model of multi-party parliamentary democracy establishes itself throughout Western Europe, if you exclude Spain and Portugal. And of course, Spain, Portugal, and Greece come into this world in the 1970s as well. So it is exceptional. It's exceptional in its uniformity. It's exceptional in its sense of a kind of common denominator form of democracy. But it also seems exceptional to us because it's also a period of relative calm. Europeans stopped killing each other, which was really quite a unique development for the period since the French Revolution. The number of people who die in wars within Europe in this period is minimal, but also the number of people who die in political violence in Europe in this period is relatively limited. And of course, now that we see the more contested, to some extent violent, or at least confrontational politics of the 1980s and 90s, thinking of Yugoslavia, you end up with a sense of closure at the end of this period when some of Europe's old conflicts very much come back. And the democracy of the present is certainly not as uniform or as stable as the democracy of that past.
You don't in the book present yourself as an oracle or a soothsayer, but I might ask you to make a prediction in any case. I think towards the end of the book, you highlight that in the 90s and with the onset of the crisis in the Balkans, that Europe was no longer the center of its own story. I think that's the phrase you may have used. Can you foresee a future in which Europe will again be the center of its own story?
I very much doubt it. I think the democratic politics of the present are very much more volatile and unpredictable. Of course, one's seen that in North America with the Trump presidency, but one sees it also in Europe with the emergence of new populist political forces, which doesn't mean that Europe is about to go back to the fascism of the 1930s. Far from it. I think within the sort of populism of the present, there is quite a lot of democratic content. It just isn't the democracy that we like or the democracy we're inclined to vote for. But I think what we are confronted by is a sense of a much more volatile, unpredictable, less party structured form of democracy. And of course, lurking around the corner is always a sense that actually Europe is a very much declined corner of the world in terms of its own sovereignty. European Union and European integration for a while gave a sense of Europe making itself sovereign. But of course, since the last economic crisis, I think there's been a certain modest realism about the ability of Europe to do that, and also a very strong sense of how Europe depends on shadows cast from other places, be that America, Russia, or most tangibly at present in European minds, China.
Martin, thanks ever so much. This has been great fun. The book again is Western Europe's Democratic Age, 1945 to 1968. It's a richly interesting book. It was a pleasure for me to work on the book, of course. And Martin, as I said before in other contexts, I really appreciated how you wrote historically, with an awareness of contingency and the complexities really of any period. So I think the book is a real contribution. I would urge everyone to read it and find it. And Martin, again, thanks ever so much for the chat.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben.